Every spring between 1843 and 1847, the genteel surface of Mississippi society shimmered with the perfume of magnolias, the rustle of silk gowns, and the deceptive calm of a world built upon cruelty. Behind the grandeur of plantations and the manicured perfection of Southern life, whispers traveled faster than the river winds, whispers of young women who vanished without a trace. They were daughters of wealth and refinement, girls who had danced beneath chandeliers and recited poetry at garden parties, yet one by one they disappeared. No funerals were held, no investigations pursued. Their families offered convenient lies: a finishing school in Paris, a cousin's marriage in Charleston, an illness cured by a long voyage. Society accepted these explanations with polite nods, because the truth would have demanded they look into the mirror and see the rot beneath their splendor. Among those whispered names, one would echo louder than the rest: Catherine Kellerman, the daughter of Lucinda Kellerman, matriarch of one of Adams County's largest estates. The Kellerman plantation sprawled over nearly 4,000 acres of fertile land. Its white, columned mansion perched above the Mississippi River like a temple to privilege. It was a place where appearances mattered more than mercy, and reputation was worth more than life itself. It was here that the facade of refinement began to crack, revealing the darkness underneath. Lucinda Kellerman ruled her estate and everyone within it with a precision that bordered on madness. At 42, she was a woman of formidable will, carved into elegance by corsets and vinegar water. Her pale face, perpetually strained by tight lacing, betrayed no warmth. To her guests, she was the epitome of grace. To her servants and her daughter, she was an unyielding force of control. Her dinner parties were social events of legend silver, arranged to catch the candlelight at perfect angles. Flowers imported from New Orleans, arranged in the exact French fashion she had studied during her brief visit to the city. Every movement was deliberate, every word measured, every smile a calculation. Her daughter Catherine, however, was everything Lucinda wished she wasn't. At 19, Catherine carried her father's gentleness in her eyes and his broad, soft frame traits her mother considered unforgivable flaws. Where Lucinda was angular and severe, Catherine was round and full, her figure an affront to the image her mother cultivated. To Lucinda, her daughter's body was not simply unbecoming, it was a rebellion. She would whisper to her confidants, voice dripping with venom, "She eats like a field hand. I gave her every advantage, and she repays me with this grotesque indulgence." What Lucinda never confessed was that Catherine's growing size was born not of gluttony, but grief. 4 years earlier, her father, Thomas Kellerman, had died in that same house. The official cause was heart failure. The truth whispered among servants, erased by Lucinda's hand, was suicide. He had been found in his study, an empty laudanum bottle at his side, a letter clutched in his hand, a letter addressed to Catherine that her mother burned before anyone could read. From that day forward, the warmth of the plantation dimmed. Lucinda's obsession deepened, not merely with her social standing, but with perfection itself: her gardens, her household, and now her only child. The Kellerman estate was a self-contained kingdom sustained by 237 enslaved men and women, each living under Lucinda's cold efficiency. Among them were 3 whose lives would intertwine with Catherine's fate: Joshua Fletcher, the blacksmith with hands hardened by years of labor; Samuel Hayes, a literate man purchased for his rare ability to read and write; and Daniel Cooper, a 16-year-old boy whose quiet eyes hid 1,000 unspoken fears. They worked different corners of the estate, yet their destinies would converge in a weathered barn on the eastern edge of the property, a place soon to become both prison and confession. That barn, built in 1820 for cotton storage, stood apart from the mansion, shrouded by a grove of live oaks. Once a symbol of industry, it now lingered in silence, a forgotten relic awaiting its new, sinister purpose. It was there that Lucinda would begin what she called the treatment. In a diary later unearthed from a trunk's false bottom, an entry dated March 15, 1843 revealed the birth of her monstrous idea: Today, she wrote, I observed the Ashworth girl, once plump, now radiant. Her mother confided in me the method of her transformation: constant labor. The body, when pushed beyond its limits, consumes itself. It burns away excess to reveal the form God intended. Why should my daughter remain a monument? Gluttony when salvation is so simple. The next morning, Lucinda summoned Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel into the parlor, an act so unusual it made the men uneasy. The fine carpets and fragile china were worlds away from the fields where they toiled. Lucinda stood before them, her voice honeyed but sharp. My daughter requires physical rehabilitation, she declared. You will oversee her daily labor in the east barn. From dawn till dusk, she will work. You will record her progress, and you will speak of this to no one. Her tone left no space for refusal. They understood the cost of disobedience, the whip, the auction block, or worse. Catherine was not consulted. She was led from her room in silence, dressed in coarse work clothes, and delivered to the barn like livestock. The first day's tasks were brutal: grinding corn by hand, carrying heavy sacks, splitting firewood until her palms bled. It was work designed not to build strength, but to break spirit. The barn echoed with the grinding of stone, the hiss of her breath, the rhythmic groan of timbers that seemed to count each hour of suffering. And through it all, Catherine did not cry. She did not beg. She worked in silence, her mind retreating somewhere far beyond her aching body. Joshua and the others followed Lucinda's orders precisely, because to do otherwise meant death. Yet even as they obeyed, they saw what Lucinda refused to see: that Catherine's suffering was not rebellion or laziness, but quiet endurance. Each afternoon, Lucinda would arrive at exactly 3 o'clock. She would circle her daughter like a scientist observing an experiment, scribbling in her journal, weight estimated at 195 pounds, hands calloused, temperament subdued, progress satisfactory. But behind those sterile words, something monstrous was taking root, not just in the barn, but across Mississippi. Lucinda's obsession would soon infect other mothers, spreading like disease among the plantation elite. What began as one woman's cruelty would become a network of hidden barns, of screams muffled by distance and propriety. And it all began here, with one mother's vanity, one daughter's pain, and one secret too terrible to remain buried forever. Under the heavy heat of the Mississippi spring, barn became its own world, a place outside of time, where daylight crawled through cracks in the walls and dust floated like ash in the still air. Catherine rose before dawn each day, her hands raw and bleeding, her dress stiff with sweat and grain dust. She worked until her muscles trembled and her vision blurred, the rhythm of her breathing blending with the scrape of the millstone and the groan of the old timbers. The air smelled of iron and cornmeal and pain. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel followed Lucinda's strict orders. Yet there was something in the way they watched her that Lucinda could not control. Their faces remained impassive, but in their silence grew a shared recognition, an understanding that cruelty, though differently shaped, had bound them all. For Catherine, the barn was at first humiliation, a punishment meant to break her will, but over days it became something unexpected, a place where her mother's gaze could not reach. There were no mirrors to reflect her shame, no whispers of comparison to other daughters, only the steady beat of her own endurance. Joshua, tall and solemn, often adjusted her workload when he thought Lucinda would not notice. Samuel, with quiet intelligence, found ways to ease her pain, showing her how to wrap her blistered hands, how to breathe through exhaustion. Daniel fetched water and watched her with wide, fearful eyes, as if witnessing a secret no one dared speak. In that strange isolation, a fragile kind of humanity began to form between them. Catherine, who had been treated as a disappointment all her life, began to feel seen. She noticed how Joshua moved with deliberate calm, his strength tempered by a gentleness that her world had never valued. She heard the quiet dignity in Samuel's speech, the stuttered courage in Daniel's voice when he dared to offer comfort. They were her jailers by command, but her protectors by choice, and though none of them would have said it aloud, each knew the danger of the bond forming there. Lucinda's visits became a cruel ritual. Every afternoon she appeared, her perfume cutting through the barn's earthy air, her parasol shading her pale face from the sun as she measured, noted, and criticized. To her, Catherine's suffering was a performance of discipline, a spectacle of purification. To Catherine, it was the slow stripping away of everything false. The more Lucinda reduced her to labor, the more she began to understand the chains that bound everyone on that land. Hers made of expectation and shame, theirs forged from iron and law. When she worked beside them, Catherine felt the world's divisions blur, if only for fleeting moments. Her hands bled as theirs did, her back ached as theirs did, and for the first time she understood the enormity of her mother's sins, not as abstractions of power, but as wounds cut into living flesh. As the weeks dragged on, Catherine's body changed. She grew leaner, her movements more sure. Lucinda's notes grew impatient. Weight reduction minimal, discipline sufficient but incomplete. The words revealed a growing frustration that Catherine's transformation was not proceeding according to plan. What Lucinda saw as failure, however, was quiet strength. Catherine no longer wept when she was ordered to lift or grind or carry. She no longer flinched when her mother entered the barn. Something unbreakable was forming beneath the exhaustion, something that terrified Lucinda without her even realizing it. Her daughter was enduring. She was surviving. By April, the barn had become a place of whispered secrets. When Lucinda left each day, Catherine and the men spoke softly, always alert to footsteps, always aware that words were dangerous things. It was Catherine who first broke the silence that had defined them. One noon, as Joshua mended a cracked wagon wheel, she asked him, "Do you hate me?" He paused, his hammer still in his hand. "No, miss," he said carefully, not meeting her eyes. "You should," she whispered. "I am everything you should hate, the daughter of your owner." Joshua's reply came after a long silence. "Hate takes energy better spent on surviving." That simple truth struck her harder than any insult her mother had ever hurled. From then on, their exchanges lengthened, about small things at first, then about everything: the world beyond the plantation, dreams of freedom, the weight of invisible prisons. Catherine told them of her father, of the letter that had been burned, of how she had felt herself disappear the day he died. Samuel told her of his time with a merchant who had taught him to read, of books he had memorized because he knew he would never be allowed to own them. Daniel spoke haltingly of his family in Louisiana, sold off one by one until he alone remained. Out of pain grew fragile trust, and out of trust, something dangerously close to love. Lucinda's cruelty spread beyond her own gates. Her method became the talk of the county's women, whispered at luncheons and tea gatherings as if it were some scientific marvel. Mothers with disobedient or unshapely daughters came to visit, claiming curiosity about the barn's miraculous results. Lucinda, basking in their admiration, led them through the oak grove to witness Catherine's ordeal. "You see," she would say proudly, "discipline reveals beauty. 3 weeks of proper labor and the excess melts away." The visitors nodded, some with approval, others with unease they dared not name. Before long, other barns began to fill across Adams County. At the Cartwright estate, the Singleton farm, the Whitfield lands, each replicating Lucinda's experiment in secret. Young women vanished under the guise of reform, their mothers insisting they were away recovering their health. None spoke of what truly occurred behind locked doors. The network grew, sustained by silence and fear. Daniel, often sent to deliver grain to neighboring plantations, began to see the pattern. "There are others," he whispered to Samuel one night as they secured the barn. "Girls like Miss Catherine, working, starving, breaking." The thought sickened them both. It was no longer one woman's madness. It was an epidemic of cruelty wrapped in lace and scripture. And yet within the barn, a quiet resistance was forming. Catherine's strength was no longer only physical. It was moral, born of knowing that her suffering was shared and that her mother's control was no longer absolute. When she looked at Joshua, she saw not a slave, but a man whose patience was deeper than the river itself. When their hands brushed while lifting grain, She felt warmth instead of shame. By June, that warmth had grown into something neither of them could name without risking everything. It began with a touch meant to steady, a look held a moment too long. In the stifling dark of the barn where no one dared to dream, they found something forbidden yet human, a defiance of the world that denied them both the right to love. Lucinda, meanwhile, grew restless, her ambition stretching beyond the plantation. She began corresponding with other families across the South, presenting her Reformation treatment as a moral enterprise. She wrote of discipline, salvation, and the restoration of proper womanhood, never mentioning the cruelty or the graves it would produce. In her mind, she was not torturing her daughter. She was saving her soul. But her creation was beginning to escape her control. Catherine's silence was no longer submission. It was preparation. Each day she endured was another day she learned who she was, who her mother truly was, and how deeply the rot of cruelty ran through the heart of Mississippi society. What began as punishment was becoming awakening, and the woman Lucinda sought to destroy was slowly gathering the strength to destroy her instead. The humid nights of early summer settled over the Kellerman estate like a shroud, and inside the barn, the boundaries between punishment and revelation blurred until Catherine could no longer tell one from the other. What had begun as an attempt to crush her will had turned into something her mother never anticipated, a transformation of spirit rather than of body. Her strength grew in silence, her movements steady and sure, and though exhaustion still haunted her every waking moment, she no longer worked as a victim. She labored like a woman who understood that survival was its own rebellion. Joshua noticed it first, the way her shoulders no longer slumped under the sacks of grain, the way her breathing steadied during the long hours of grinding corn. Samuel, ever observant, saw it too in the subtle shift of her eyes, a calm that came not from submission, but from the quiet defiance of endurance. Even Daniel, whose youth made him fearful of every shadow, began to draw courage from her presence. Lucinda's afternoon visits became shorter, her tone sharper, her satisfaction replaced by frustration as she realized that the cruel miracle she had promised society's ladies was failing to unfold. Her diary entries grew colder, weight reduction insufficient, further restriction required, consider extending work into night hours. She could not see that her experiment was creating something far more dangerous than a thinner daughter. It was creating a daughter who no longer feared her. Joshua's kindness deepened into quiet devotion, the kind that needed no words. When Catherine faltered, his hand was there before she could fall. When her lips cracked from thirst, he slipped her sips of water meant for himself. Samuel, too, began to risk more, sneaking small portions of food from the quarters to keep her alive when Lucinda's rations grew cruelly sparse. Each act of mercy was an act of rebellion, and with every secret kindness, the invisible lines that divided them, race, class, and ownership, blurred further. In the stillness between labor, Catherine found herself drawn to Joshua's voice, deep and steady like the rhythm of the forge. They spoke softly about things that would have been impossible outside those walls: freedom, love, God, and the injustice of a world built on the suffering of others. For Joshua, her words were dangerous, but they reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten: that there were still white souls capable of seeing his humanity. For Catherine, his quiet strength became an anchor, a proof that compassion could exist even in a place as cruel as the Kellerman estate. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Samuel, always cautious, warned Joshua that danger grew with every lingering glance. "There's no world where this ends well," he whispered one night, "but maybe it don't have to last forever to mean something." Joshua understood the risk but could no longer resist the gravity between them. One sweltering afternoon, when Catherine stumbled beneath the weight of a grain sack, he caught her before she fell. The world went still in that moment, the soft rasp of their breathing, the dust in the air, the faint sound of cicadas outside, and neither moved away. It was as if the cruel universe paused to give them one fragment of peace before crushing them again. "We shouldn't," Catherine whispered, though her voice trembled not with fear but with longing. "No," Joshua murmured, "we shouldn't." Yet they did not part. That brief touch became the first thread in a forbidden connection that would soon alter all their fates. Outside the barn, Lucinda's ambitions spread like wildfire through the county. What she called rehabilitation became a fashionable cruelty among the Southern gentry. Her letters circulated quietly among plantation wives from Alabama to Georgia, each describing in cold precision the transformation of their daughters through labor and discipline. The method's success, she claimed, depended upon secrecy and unwavering enforcement. Those who questioned it were dismissed as sentimental. What none of these women realized was that their daughters were vanishing into silence. Some returned frail and hollow-eyed, their spirits broken. Others simply disappeared, their families inventing convenient lies of sudden marriages or mysterious illnesses. Daniel, sent occasionally on errands, returned one evening pale and shaken. "I saw the Cartwright barn," he told Samuel, his stutter worse than usual. "It's empty, cleaned, like they was hiding something." The pattern became unmistakable. Each girl Lucinda had advised another mother about was gone. The barns were scrubbed clean, the earth behind them freshly turned. Something monstrous was spreading beneath the polite society of Mississippi, and it all traced back to Lucinda Kellerman. Inside her own estate, Lucinda began to sense a shift she could not name. Catherine's body, though leaner, carried a new strength that unsettled her. The daughter who once cowered now met her gaze with calm composure. During one inspection, Lucinda struck her across the face for answering too slowly. Catherine neither flinched nor cried. "Do you feel nothing?" Lucinda hissed. Catherine's voice was quiet but steady. "Not for you." That night, Lucinda wrote in her diary, defiance developing, dangerous, must consider alternate remedies. But it was too late. Whatever control she had once possessed was eroding. The barn that had been her instrument of dominance had become her undoing. By midsummer, Catherine and Joshua's stolen moments had grown into something both beautiful and doomed. They spoke of escape in whispers, of a world beyond the Mississippi, though both knew the impossibility of it. Still, hope is a stubborn thing. It survives where logic dies. Samuel, ever pragmatic, said little but began observing more carefully the routines of guards and patrols, the paths through the woods that led toward the river. Daniel, though fearful, listened to every plan, memorizing them like prayers. Beneath the moonlight that filtered through the barn's slats, they began to imagine freedom not as a dream but as a direction. But Lucinda's world was expanding faster than their hope. Her letters spoke now of profit, of publishing her findings, of offering consultations to families burdened with wayward daughters. In her mind, cruelty had become commerce, the correction of female indolence through measured labor. She wrote proudly, envisioning her name printed beside it. Yet, while she plotted her ascent, the foundation of her empire, her daughter's obedience, was slipping away. Catherine had begun to think of herself not as a prisoner, but as a witness. She knew now that she had seen too much to remain silent, that if she ever escaped this place, she would tell the world what her mother had done. She began to pray each night, not for rescue, but for the strength to survive long enough to speak the truth. And somewhere in the dark, Joshua's quiet voice answered her prayers with a promise he dared not say aloud. "We will get out, miss. One way or another, we will get out." The sweltering air of late July clung to everything, turning the barn into a furnace where sweat ran like tears and hope burned low. Yet beneath that suffocating heat, a secret had begun to take shape, one that would shatter the delicate facade of Lucinda Kellerman's world. Catherine, her body leaner but her spirit unbroken, began to sense new life stirring within her, an unfamiliar flutter that filled her with both awe and dread. The realization came slowly, confirmed by missed courses and bouts of nausea, that she could no longer explain away. One afternoon, while Joshua mended a broken harness, she whispered the words that changed everything, "I am with child." The silence that followed felt like eternity before Joshua's face softened, his eyes heavy with fear and love. He reached for her hand, a forbidden act in a forbidden world. "Then we must find a way," he murmured, but both knew what her mother would do if she discovered the truth. Lucinda's obsession with purity would never allow a scandal so damning. Her daughter pregnant by a man she owned. It would mean death for Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel, and for Catherine, something worse. That night, the four of them gathered in the dim light of a single lantern, whispering plans between heartbeats. Samuel, with his rare literacy and cunning mind, had been quietly studying the plantation's ledgers and letters, searching for any weakness in Lucinda's empire. What he found chilled them to the bone: lists of names of other girls, each marked with an ominous final word, resolved. The missing daughters of Mississippi were not away at schools or married off to cousins. They were dead, buried in shallow graves behind barns just like this one. "We must leave," Joshua said, his voice low but certain. "Not just for us, for all of them." The plan was desperate, fragile as glass, and every step depended on precision. Catherine revealed what her mother did not know. Her late father had hidden money and documents in his study, including a letter he had once written her before his death. A letter Lucinda had burned, but Catherine remembered the drawer he used. That night, pretending to be ill, she convinced Lucinda to send her back to the house. When darkness fell, she crept through the silent halls, the creak of the floorboards echoing like a heartbeat. In her mother's room, she found the music box where the key lay hidden, just as she remembered. Inside the study, the air smelled of dust and tobacco and grief. There she found not only the money, $300 in old bills, but a collection of letters that revealed a truth her mother had buried. Her father had planned to free every enslaved soul on the Kellerman estate. He had written to lawyers in Philadelphia, arranged legal documents, even drafted a will leaving the plantation to Catherine with orders to grant manumission to all. He had died before he could act, and Lucinda, fearing ruin, had forged his signature, claiming the property as her own. When Catherine read the final letter addressed to her, his confession, his apology, his plea for her to do what he could not, the tears came quietly, falling on the parchment like drops of redemption. She hid the letters and money in her coat and returned to the barn before dawn, her body trembling not from fear, but from the weight of her father's ghost urging her to finish what he had begun. The next day, Lucinda announced that Dr. Harrison would inspect Catherine's condition, a visit that meant discovery, and discovery meant death. "We leave tonight," Joshua said with finality. Samuel's task was to find a forger in Natchez who could create false travel papers. Catherine would pose as a young widow traveling north with 3 enslaved servants. Daniel, too young to flee without arousing suspicion, would stay behind to stall Lucinda, claiming Catherine had escaped alone and threatening him into silence. They spent the day preparing, Samuel slipping away under the cover of dusk with $50, Joshua collecting supplies and 2 hidden knives, Catherine writing letters she might never deliver. One was for her father, one for Daniel, and one for Lucinda herself, a letter of rage and truth, meant to be the last word she ever spoke to her mother. When Samuel returned near midnight with forged documents and passage for a steamboat north, hope flared like a match in the dark. The papers named her Mrs. Catherine Kellerman, widow, accompanied by 3 servants valued at $3,000, traveling to Kentucky to settle debts. The irony was cruel. They would escape by pretending to be what society demanded of them. As they packed their meager belongings, Daniel's frightened voice trembled in the shadows. "Miss Catherine," he whispered, "the other girls, they're gone. The barns were scrubbed clean." The words hit her like a blow. Her mother had not just tormented her, she had orchestrated murder in the name of beauty. "We'll expose her," Catherine said, her voice fierce despite the tears burning in her eyes. "We'll make them all see." But Joshua shook his head, steady and sorrowful. "We must live first. Truth means nothing if we don't survive to tell it." At 2 in the morning, they slipped into the night, moving through the grove of oaks that had witnessed so much suffering. Behind them, Daniel watched silent and trembling as the three figures disappeared into darkness, carrying with them the last fragile hope that any of them would ever be free. The night swallowed them whole as they moved through the fields, the air thick with humidity and fear, each step a gamble. Against the unforgiving silence of the Mississippi woods, Catherine clutched the small satchel to her chest. The letters, the money, the forged papers, their only proof of truth, their only weapon against the monstrous lie her mother had built. Joshua led the way, his figure a dark silhouette against the faint silver glow of the moon, while Samuel walked a few paces behind, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows for movement, every rustle of leaves a threat. The road to Natchez stretched 8 miles, but it felt endless, each minute dragging beneath the weight of uncertainty. Catherine's shoes tore at her feet, her lungs burned, but she did not falter. The thought of Lucinda's discovery pushed her forward, the image of her mother's cold eyes haunting every heartbeat. Just a few more miles, Joshua whispered, offering her his hand when she stumbled on uneven ground. His touch, even fleeting, steadied her more than any prayer could. By the time the first hints of dawn colored the sky, they reached the outskirts of Natchez, where the Mississippi River shimmered faintly in the distance like a promise of escape. The city was waking, dockworkers shouting, carriage wheels clattering against cobblestones, and the distant whistle of a steamboat preparing for departure. They paused in an alley near the waterfront, breathless and dirty but alive. Catherine removed her outer shawl, straightened her dress, and tried to gather what little composure she had left. In that moment, she ceased to be a frightened daughter and became the widow her forged papers claimed she was. At the steamboat office, the clerk looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from disinterest to mild suspicion at the sight of a well-bred woman traveling with 3 enslaved men. Catherine felt her pulse pounding in her throat but channeled her mother's practiced poise, meeting his eyes with icy confidence. "I require passage to Louisville," she said evenly, placing the documents on the counter. The clerk examined them, and for a dreadful moment she thought he might see through the forgery. Then, with a polite nod, he said, "The Morning Star departs at 8. I can arrange a private cabin for you and quarters for your property in the cargo hold." The word property sliced through her like a knife, but she forced a smile. "That will be acceptable." She paid with trembling hands, and when he handed her the tickets and wished her a peaceful journey, relief flooded through her like water to parched soil. They stepped back into the morning light, and for the first time freedom felt tangible. But just as they turned toward the docks, Samuel's voice broke the fragile calm. "We are being watched." Catherine followed his gaze to a man standing near a warehouse, a laborer by dress, but too still, too focused. When their eyes met, he turned sharply and disappeared down the street. "Slave catcher," Joshua said under his breath. He recognized something. Panic clawed at them as they quickened their pace, trying to appear calm but failing to shake the sense of impending doom. The dock was a chaos of movement, porters loading cargo, children running underfoot, officers checking manifests, but to Catherine it all blurred into noise and danger. The captain of the Morning Star, an older man with a weathered face, examined her ticket and raised a brow. "Traveling alone, ma'am. My husband passed recently," she replied, her voice steady. "These men are being transported north for sale to settle debts." The captain studied her for a long, dreadful moment before finally stepping aside. "Board quickly," he said. "We leave in 1 hour." Once aboard, Catherine allowed herself a single breath of relief as she gazed across the wide river, its dark surface gleaming like the edge of a blade. Below deck, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel were escorted toward the cargo hold, but the first mate seemed distracted, allowing them to linger near Catherine's cabin longer than he should have. "Something's wrong," Samuel whispered. "The crew knows something. She pressed her hand to her stomach, a silent prayer forming in her mind. If only they could depart before her mother arrived. Every tick of the clock dragged like a scream in her ears. At 7:30, a commotion erupted on the dock, shattering the fragile illusion of safety. Lucinda had come. Her carriage stopped in a cloud of dust, and she emerged draped in mourning black, her face calm but her eyes aflame with fury. Behind her rode the county sheriff and 3 armed men. Catherine watched from her cabin's porthole as her mother approached the captain, gesturing sharply, her lips forming words that carried even across the water. "That girl is my daughter. Those men are stolen property." The captain's jaw tightened. After a brief exchange, he nodded grimly and allowed her aboard. Catherine's heart stopped. Footsteps thundered on the deck, voices barked orders, and the door to her cabin burst open. Lucinda stood framed in the doorway, her elegance unshaken, her voice cold as marble. "Did you truly believe you could escape me?" Behind her, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel were forced into the room at gunpoint, their wrists bound. For a moment, no one moved. Then Catherine spoke, her voice trembling but fierce. "I found Father's will. I know what you did. You forged his name, stole this land, and murdered those girls." Lucinda's composure cracked for the briefest instant before hardening again. "Your father was weak. I preserved what he would have thrown away. Those girls were failures of constitution, nothing more." Catherine's stomach turned at the casual cruelty. "You killed them," she said, her voice breaking. "All of them?" Lucinda's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "They were unfit for the world I built. You will not make the same mistake." Her gaze shifted to Joshua, cold and venomous. "And this one will hang before the week is out." Before anyone could move, Joshua lunged forward, but the sheriff's man struck him with the butt of his rifle, sending him crashing to the floor. "Stop!" Catherine screamed. "I'll go with you, just don't hurt them." Lucinda's tone remained eerily calm. "Oh, they will be hurt, my dear. They will be made examples." When Samuel spoke, his voice was clear and desperate, every word an act of defiance. "Others know. Letters have been sent north. Every lie, every murder, it's all written down. If you kill us, the truth will reach Philadelphia, Boston, New York." It was a bluff, but a brilliant one. Lucinda hesitated, her eyes flickering with the first spark of doubt she had ever shown. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "If that's true, ma'am, you may have trouble beyond Mississippi." Lucinda snapped, "They're lying." But her voice wavered, and Catherine saw fear bloom behind her mother's perfect mask. Still, power was on Lucinda's side. "Take them," she ordered, "all of them. Jail first, questions later." As they were dragged off the steamboat, Catherine met Joshua's eyes one last time. In that look, there was love, resignation, and an unspoken farewell. The streets of Natchez blurred as they were herded toward the county jail. And in that endless moment of despair, Catherine realized she had crossed from her mother's control into something even darker. Yet amid the terror, one truth remained unbroken within her. She had seen Lucinda Kellerman for what she truly was, not a mother, not even human, but the living embodiment of the evil that ruled the South. Whatever came next, Catherine swore she would outlive it. She would survive long enough to tell the world what her mother had done. The jail at Natchez was a stone carcass that swallowed hope whole, its walls thick with damp and decay, the air so heavy with sweat and despair that even breathing felt like surrender. Catherine sat in the darkness of her cell, her wrists bruised from the iron shackles, her dress torn, her body trembling from exhaustion and grief. Across the narrow corridor, Joshua lay against the wall, blood crusted along his temple where the rifle had struck him. Samuel and Daniel were locked farther down, their voices little more than whispers through the stone. The sheriff had given orders that they be held for questioning, though everyone knew what that meant. Lucinda had powerful friends in Adams County, men who owed her favors, men who would not question her word. She had already begun weaving her story, her daughter, fragile and unwell, abducted by slaves who had conspired to kill her and steal money from the estate. It was a lie that the town would believe, as they always did when power spoke. But Catherine no longer feared the lie. Something inside her had shifted, burned away by rage and revelation. The memory of her father's letters pulsed like fire in her mind. Proof of everything her mother had buried, proof of the world's rot. She pressed her hands to her stomach, whispering to the life growing inside her, "You will not be born into her world." That promise became her strength. The days passed in a blur of interrogation and humiliation. Lucinda visited only once, sweeping into the cell block as if attending a luncheon, her silk gown brushing against the filth of the floor. "You've shamed this family," she said softly, her eyes like polished glass. "But I will correct it. You will return home, and the others will be dealt with as law demands." Catherine met her gaze with steady defiance. "You cannot kill truth." Lucinda's lips twitched in something between amusement and pity. "Truth," she said, "is what people choose to believe, and they believe me." She turned to go, her perfume lingering like poison in the air, but Catherine called after her. "Father wrote you out of his will." Lucinda froze. "I read the letters," Catherine continued, her voice low and unwavering. "He planned to free them all. You forged his signature and buried his body before anyone could know." For the first time, Catherine saw fear flicker across her mother's perfect face. Lucinda said nothing, only turned and left with her composure fractured like glass. That night, Samuel whispered through the darkness, "If she's scared, she'll make a mistake. That's when we move." His mind, even in chains, never stopped planning. A week later, the chance came. The jail's night guard, a weary man named Harlan, was known for his gambling debts and easy greed. Samuel had been watching him, listening, calculating. When Harlan made his rounds, Samuel offered him what little they had left, one of the gold buttons from Joshua's torn coat and a promise of more if he would deliver a letter. To the office of the Natchez Courier, Samuel said, "There's money waiting for you there." Harlan hesitated, eyeing the prisoners, then took the folded paper and disappeared into the night. The letter, written in Samuel's careful hand and signed with Catherine's name, told everything. The barns, the missing girls, the forged will, the killings buried under Lucinda's lies. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had left. Days passed without word, each sunrise another measure of dread. Joshua grew weaker from his wound, Daniel refused to eat, and Catherine's strength began to fade. Yet in the stillness a faint hope stirred. One morning, the sheriff entered looking uneasy. "Your mother's gone to Jackson," he muttered, called before the governor to explain the disappearances. "Seems someone's been asking questions." Samuel smiled faintly in the darkness. The letter had found its way. The following night, chaos broke through the silence. Hoofbeats thundered outside, voices shouted orders, and the sound of boots echoed through the hall. The door to the jail burst open, and men in federal uniforms stormed in, led by a stern-faced marshal from New Orleans. "By order of the state and federal authorities," he announced, "these prisoners are to be released pending investigation into the Kellerman estate." The sheriff sputtered protests, but the marshal silenced him with a glare. The keys clattered in trembling hands, and for the first time in weeks, the iron doors swung open. Catherine stepped into the humid night air, her legs weak, her eyes burning with disbelief. Joshua caught her when she stumbled, his hand trembling as he brushed dirt from her hair. "We're free," he whispered, the words fragile as glass. Samuel nodded, for now. But freedom, they knew, was only a word until they were beyond Lucinda's reach. The marshal's men escorted them to a waiting carriage, explaining that the governor's office had received evidence of multiple disappearances linked to Lucinda's reform barns. Investigations were underway across 3 counties, and warrants were being prepared. "You're safer heading north," the marshal said quietly. "The woman you call mother won't stop until she's buried or bound." At dawn, the carriage rolled out of Natchez, its wheels rattling over the rough road toward the river. The sun rose like a wound across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Catherine sat between Joshua and Samuel, her hands resting on her stomach, the child within her stirring faintly as if sensing the road ahead. Behind them, the town receded into shadow, and though freedom still lay far away, the air tasted of something new. Uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. Daniel, who had stayed silent most of the journey, finally spoke in a voice both small and steady. "What'll we do now?" Catherine looked out at the Mississippi, vast and gleaming under the morning light. "We'll keep moving," she said, "until her lies can't follow us any more." Samuel's lips curved in a faint smile. "Then we'll keep moving forever." None of them knew what awaited them on the other side of the river, only that they were together, alive, and beyond the reach of the woman who had built her empire on pain. As the carriage reached the ferry dock, Catherine turned one last time toward the horizon of her old life. Somewhere behind those trees, her mother still ruled her decaying kingdom of barns and secrets, but the world was already beginning to whisper the truth. And for the first time, Catherine let herself believe that survival was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something greater, the reckoning her mother could no longer silence. The ferry drifted slowly across the Mississippi, its creaking hull slicing through the dark water that glimmered like liquid iron under the rising sun, carrying Catherine, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel toward the uncertain promise of freedom. Each stroke of the oars seemed to echo with ghosts, the cries of the vanished girls, the prayers of the enslaved, the unspoken fears that clung to the air like mist. Catherine sat with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her mind flickering between the unbearable past and the fragile hope of what lay ahead. Her body ached from exhaustion, her wrists still marked with bruises, yet her gaze remained steady on the horizon. Joshua watched her silently, his hand resting protectively over hers, while Samuel, ever cautious, kept his eyes trained on the riverbanks. "We'll cross into Louisiana by midday," he murmured, though the words sounded less like assurance and more like a prayer. Daniel, the youngest, sat quietly at their feet, his eyes wide and haunted. He had seen too much for his years, yet a faint spark of wonder shone through his fear as he watched the world beyond the plantation unfold for the first time. The river was vast, eternal, carrying with it stories of pain and redemption. And in that endless current, Catherine felt something stir within her. Not just the life growing in her womb, but a strength she had never known. She thought of her father's words, the hidden letters she still carried close to her heart, and understood now that his dream of freedom had not died. It had simply waited for her to be born into it. By the time they reached the opposite shore, the sun was high, and the oppressive heat pressed down like a hand. They disembarked quietly, avoiding the main road, moving instead through the thickets and back trails Samuel remembered from old maps. He had planned everything meticulously. The forged papers would hold long enough to get them to Vicksburg, where sympathetic abolitionists might offer refuge, but danger lingered behind every sound. News traveled fast along the river, and Lucinda's wealth could reach far beyond Mississippi. Each time they passed a traveler or wagon, Joshua positioned himself slightly in front of Catherine, his tall frame shielding her from prying eyes. "If they ask," he said softly, "you're my mistress, and we're moving north to settle debts." Catherine nodded, her voice trembling but resolute. "Then let's keep walking before debts come to collect." Their journey became a blur of motion, days spent hiding in woods, nights sleeping beneath the open sky, the silence broken only by the hum of insects and the crackle of distant thunder. Rain came on the third day, cold and relentless, soaking their clothes and turning the dirt path into rivers of mud. Catherine pressed her shawl around her belly, shivering as Joshua built a small fire under the shelter of an oak. Samuel handed her a piece of bread he had managed to trade for at a farmhouse. She took it with gratitude, breaking it in half to share with Daniel. In that moment, huddled in the rain with the men who had become her family, she realized that freedom was not a place but a condition of the soul. They were hunted, starving, uncertain, and yet, for the first time, she was unafraid. But fate, cruel as ever, refused to grant them peace for long. Near the outskirts of Vicksburg, as dusk bled into night, the sound of horses shattered the quiet. Samuel froze. "Riders," he whispered, his voice taut with dread. Within moments, torches flared through the trees, their orange light flickering like fire in a nightmare. Catherine's pulse quickened. "They've found us." Joshua grabbed her hand, run!" They scattered through the darkness, crashing through brush and roots, the shouts of men closing in behind them. Gunfire cracked through the air, splintering branches. Catherine ran until her lungs burned, clutching the satchel that held her father's letters, the only proof of their innocence. Behind her, Samuel's voice rang out, shouting for them to keep going. She turned once and saw him fighting, swinging a fallen branch at one of the riders before being struck to the ground. "No," she screamed, but Joshua pulled her onward. "He's buying us time," he said through clenched teeth. They didn't stop until they reached a narrow ravine, the moonlight filtering faintly through the trees. There, hidden among the rocks, Catherine collapsed, her chest heaving, tears streaking down her dirt-covered face. "Samuel," she whispered, but Joshua only shook his head, grief and rage twisting his features. "We can't go back." Daniel crouched beside them, shaking uncontrollably, his small voice breaking. "They'll kill us next." Catherine gripped his hands tightly. "No, they won't," she said, forcing the words through her sobs. "We'll live, and we'll make sure the world knows what they did. To Samuel, to the girls, to all of us." Her voice, though cracked, carried the weight of conviction. The night around them felt endless, yet somewhere beyond the trees the first faint glimmer of dawn began to rise. By morning, they reached the edge of the river once more, where a small trading boat waited, its captain a wiry man with gray hair and eyes sharp as glass. He looked them over, three figures soaked, bruised, and desperate, and after a long silence he said, "You're running from someone." Catherine met his gaze without flinching. "We're running towards something," she replied. The man studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then get aboard." As the boat drifted north, leaving the burning horizon of Mississippi behind, Catherine stood at the bow, her hand resting on her stomach, her eyes fixed on the distant line where water met sky. The wind tangled her hair, the scent of rain and river filling her lungs, and she thought of Samuel, his courage, his brilliance, his sacrifice. "He's with us," Joshua said quietly beside her. "Always will be." She nodded, her heart aching yet resolute. The current carried them forward, steady and unrelenting, as the land that had enslaved and betrayed them faded into memory. They did not yet know where the river would take them or what awaited at its end. But for the first time, the fear that had ruled their lives began to lift, replaced by something pure, purpose. In the rhythm of the waves and the hum of the wind, Catherine heard the faint echo of her father's voice, a whisper carried by the river's eternal flow. "Keep going, child. The truth will find its way home." The boat glided through the broad, churning river as if carrying the last fragments of a forgotten world, its wooden hull creaking with each rise and fall of the current. For 3 days and nights, Catherine, Joshua, and Daniel drifted northward, half-starved and sleepless, their bodies worn thin but their spirits anchored by the stubborn will to survive. The wind carried the scent of mud and magnolia, mingled with the faint echoes of distant thunder that rolled like a warning through the hills. Catherine sat at the bow most nights, watching the shifting water that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside her. The grief for Samuel, the hatred for her mother, the fear for the unborn child stirring quietly beneath her ribs. Joshua often joined her in silence, his rough hand resting over hers, a gesture that spoke of protection and quiet devotion. "He didn't die for nothing," Joshua said one night, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Samuel wanted you free. He wanted all of us free." Catherine turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the lantern's dim glow. "Freedom feels like a word we'll never catch," she whispered. "We keep reaching, but it keeps floating farther away." Joshua looked out at the horizon, his jaw tightening. "Maybe freedom isn't something you catch. Maybe it's something you keep walking toward even when you can't see it." His words lingered with her through the long, sleepless night, becoming a rhythm that matched the steady beat of the river. By dawn, they reached the narrow outskirts of Helena, a small port town where steamboats docked to trade goods and news from the north. The captain who had helped them disembark without question took his payment, a ring Catherine had once worn in her mother's house, and wished them luck, warning that bounty posters had begun to circulate along the Mississippi, describing a runaway woman with 2 male slaves. Catherine's stomach tightened as she read the crude sketch scrawled in ink that bore an unsettling resemblance to her own face. "She's still hunting us," she murmured. Joshua nodded grimly. "Lucinda won't stop until she's certain we're gone or dead." Disguised as travelers heading towards St. Louis, they blended into the crowds of dockworkers and traders, moving cautiously through the busy port. Daniel, small and quick, gathered scraps of information by listening to conversations, returning with pieces of news that painted a grim picture. The Kellerman estate had been seized by state authorities after reports of inhumane confinement, and Lucinda herself had been detained for questioning, though rumor said she was already bribing her way free. "If she escapes trial," Catherine said through clenched teeth, "she'll come after us again." Joshua placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." They rented a wagon from a weathered man named Oates, who asked no questions and charged too much, and began their journey inland through Arkansas. The land rolled in endless green hills, broken only by the sound of insects and the crackle of dry brush beneath the wheels. Food was scarce, and more than once they went hungry, surviving on river fish and roots Joshua managed to dig up. At night, Catherine would read her father's letters aloud by firelight, her voice trembling but strong. "He wanted to build a world without chains," she said, tracing the faded ink with her finger. "He believed there was goodness left, even in people like her." Joshua stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Maybe there was once, but not anymore." His voice carried a bitterness that frightened her, a weariness born from too many lifetimes of servitude. "Don't lose your faith, Joshua," she said softly. "It's all we have left." He looked at her then, and for the first time in days, his eyes softened. "I haven't lost it," he said. "It just hurts to carry." By the second week, they reached a small settlement along the Missouri border, a place of rough cabins and muddy roads where no one asked where you came from as long as you worked. Catherine found shelter in a widow's house. Mrs. Langley, a stern but kind woman who took pity on her after seeing the exhaustion and the swell of her belly. "You're safe here, child," she said, ushering her inside. "Whatever you're running from, let the river keep it." Catherine wanted to believe her, but deep inside, she knew the river carried everything forward, truth, sin, and vengeance alike. Joshua and Daniel found work cutting timber at a nearby mill, while Catherine helped Mrs. Langley tend her garden and care for her chickens. For the first time since leaving Natchez, there was quiet, a fragile illusion of normal life. At night, when the crickets sang and the wind rustled through the grass, Catherine would close her eyes and imagine the child's future. A place where the color of his father's skin and the name of his mother's family would not be chains. Yet peace, she knew, was temporary. Her nightmares returned near the end of the month. Dreams of her mother's voice echoing through the barn, of iron chains clattering against oak beams, of fire consuming the fields. One morning, she awoke to find Mrs. Langley standing by her bed, holding a folded newspaper. "You should see this," the old woman said, her voice cautious. The headline struck like lightning. "Lucinda Kellerman found dead in custody. Suicide or retribution." Catherine read the words again and again, unable to believe them. The article described how Lucinda had been found in her cell at Jackson, hanging from a strip of silk torn from her own dress. The governor's office declared it a suicide, but whispers suggested otherwise, that she had been silenced to keep others' names from surfacing. Catherine's hands shook as she handed the paper to Joshua. "It's over," she said, though her voice held no triumph. He read in silence, then met her eyes. "No," he said softly, "it's not over. It never really ends. But now, maybe, it can begin again." She nodded, understanding. The ghosts would never truly fade, but the chain that bound them to Lucinda's cruelty had finally snapped. That night, as the rain fell softly outside, Catherine sat by the window and watched the dark fields breathe under the moonlight. child moved within her, a faint, reassuring flutter that brought both ache and hope. "You'll never know her," she whispered. "You'll never know that house or those chains. You'll be born free." Joshua entered quietly and placed his hand over hers, feeling the small movement beneath her skin. For a long time they said nothing. Words were too fragile for what they felt: grief, love, relief, and the solemn weight of survival. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and freedom. Catherine looked toward the horizon, where the clouds had begun to break, and for the first time the world felt wide enough for her to breathe. Lucinda's empire had turned to dust, the barns empty, and the silence of her cruelty finally broken. And in that silence Catherine understood that her story, their story, was no longer one of suffering, but of endurance. They had become something her mother could never control, something stronger than the lies that built her world. They had become free. The final months passed like a slow exhale after years of holding breath, the days folding into one another as if time itself had grown gentle. The small settlement along the Missouri border became their quiet refuge, a place where the world did not ask questions about the past. Catherine's body grew heavy with the weight of new life, her steps slower, her face paler, but her spirit burned steady, luminous as the lantern that glowed each night beside her bed. Joshua built a small cabin with his own hands at the edge of the woods, where the trees stood like guardians and the air smelled of pine and rain. Daniel, though still haunted by nightmares, began to laugh again, his voice small but real, carrying through the clearing like a song the earth itself had longed to hear. For the first time there was peace, not the hollow quiet of submission, but the calm that follows surviving the storm. They had all come through fire, and though the scars would never vanish, they had learned to live beside them rather than beneath them. Catherine spent her mornings tending the small garden she planted outside the cabin: corn, beans, and a single row of wildflowers that reminded her of the fields she once worked in chains. The soil here was softer, forgiving. Each sprout felt like a promise that the world, though cruel, could still grow something good from its ruins. Joshua worked long hours at the mill but always returned before dusk, his shoulders bent from labor but his eyes alight whenever he saw her standing by the porch. Sometimes they would sit together without speaking, their hands entwined, watching the sun disappear behind the distant hills. In those moments words were unnecessary. The silence between them was its own kind of prayer. Catherine often thought of Samuel during those quiet evenings, his laughter echoing faintly through her memory, his voice reminding her to keep walking toward freedom, even when the path vanished beneath her feet. She liked to believe he could see them now, that he watched over Daniel, over the unborn child, over the fragile peace they had carved out of a brutal world. Yet even peace carried shadows. Some nights, Catherine would wake with her heart racing, certain she heard Lucinda's heels clicking across the floorboards, her cold voice whispering from the dark. But when she opened her eyes, there was only the soft glow of moonlight and Joshua's steady breathing beside her. Slowly, the fear loosened its grip, fading into something distant and hollow. Lucinda was gone, her empire of cruelty erased by its own rot, but Catherine understood that evil did not vanish. It merely changed form, waiting to be named again. Still, she had broken the cycle in her bloodline. The child she carried would never know chains or barns or the weight of her mother's shame. That knowledge filled her with a strength that no fear could steal. The morning she went into labor, the sky was a deep, endless gray, rain drumming softly against the roof, as if the heavens themselves were washing the world clean. Joshua stayed beside her, holding her hand through every scream, every breath, his face wet with tears and sweat. When the child finally arrived, a boy with skin like bronze and eyes the color of the river at dusk, Catherine wept, not from pain but from awe. She held him close, his heartbeat fluttering against her chest, and whispered, "You're free, my love. You'll never be what she wanted me to be." Mrs. Langley, who had come to help, smiled through her own tears. "He's strong," she said softly, "strong like his mother." Joshua leaned over and kissed Catherine's forehead, his voice breaking, "Like both of us." They named the boy Samuel, in honor of the man who had given them their chance at life. The days that followed were filled with exhaustion and quiet joy. Joshua built a small cradle by hand, and Daniel carved tiny wooden animals to hang above it. At night, Catherine would rock the baby by the firelight, singing soft, wordless lullabies that carried through the cabin like gentle ghosts. Each note felt like a release, a way of letting go of everything that had been stolen. As winter approached, the land turned pale and still, the air crisp with the scent of frost. The world seemed to pause in reverence, as if recognizing the fragile miracle unfolding within their cabin. Catherine often walked to the edge of the woods, Samuel bundled against her chest, and stood watching the river beyond the trees. It shimmered under the pale sun, flowing endlessly north, carrying stories of pain, love, and endurance toward places she could only imagine. One afternoon, Joshua joined her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever think about going farther?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but maybe freedom isn't a place we have to find. Maybe it's something we build right here." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll keep building." The wind stirred through the trees, scattering the last of the autumn leaves, and in that moment Catherine felt the world settle into stillness, the kind of stillness that meant peace had finally taken root. Years later, when Samuel was old enough to walk the fields alone, Catherine would tell him stories, not of chains or cruelty, but of courage, of people who had once been broken, but refused to stay that way. She told him about a man who taught her to see strength in silence, another who gave his life so she could live, and a river that carried them all toward freedom. "And your grandmother?" the boy once asked, his small voice curious. Catherine looked out toward the woods, the light of the setting sun painting the trees gold. "She was a woman who forgot what love was," she said softly. "And when you forget love, you lose everything." Samuel nodded, his young mind unable to grasp the weight of her words, but she smiled and let it be. Some truths were meant to grow with time. As the years slipped quietly past, the Kellerman name faded into dust, remembered only in whispers of scandal and ruin. But in that small clearing near the Missouri border, life bloomed. Catherine's garden grew wide and wild, the soil rich with the promise of new beginnings. Joshua's laughter filled the air again, deeper now, steadier. Daniel, once a frightened boy, became a teacher to others who had fled the old world, showing them how to read, how to plant, how to live free. And Catherine, who had once been her mother's prisoner, became something her mother could never have imagined. A storyteller, a mother, a survivor. On quiet evenings, when the air turned cool and the stars hung low, she would sit by the porch with Samuel at her feet, telling him how the river had carried them away from darkness into light. And when she grew silent, listening to the crickets sing and the wind hum through the trees, she knew that the ghosts had finally gone still. The barns were gone, the chains rusted, and the woman who built her empire on suffering was nothing more than a name fading into history. What remained was love, tender, imperfect, but alive, and the unbroken truth that no cruelty, no matter how powerful, could outlast the will to be free.